Alright, welcome to the second video in chapter number 5. Today we're going to cover our guide to reading questions 5 through 8. Things like, what were the hopes of the colonists after the French-Indian War was over, and compare that with what really happened, what was the reality. We also are going to take a look at why did the British troops stick around in the colonies after the French-Indian War was over. Why didn't they leave? Why didn't they go back home? Being that the French were kind of eradicated from the colony. We're also going to look at a series of laws that were passed by the British government that affected the colonists. What effect did it have on it? What was the response? That sort of thing. And last but certainly not least, we're going to take a look at some of the ideas by a guy by the name of John Locke, who greatly influences the attitudes of colonists during this kind of important time after the French and Indian War. We're also going to kind of see that Locke is going to greatly influence the creation of American government, and kind of those thoughts and those feelings and that creation is felt even today. So he's a kind of important figure in all of this. But let's get started talking a little bit about what the feeling was like after the end of the French and Indian War. Very simply put, the colonists were really proud to be British. They were proud of all the contributions they made to the war effort. They were very optimistic that there would be an end to what they thought were high taxes by the British government. In reality, they were taxed at a lesser rate than people that actually lived in Great Britain, but they still felt they paid too much in taxes. I think that's kind of a universal thing in history. Everybody always feels like that. So they thought they would get a better deal maybe from the British government. They really were excited about the possibility of all the territory that was gained after the British victory in the French and Indian War, particularly the Ohio River Valley. That would create a lot of opportunities for settlement, a lot of opportunities for prosperity among citizens. So people were extremely optimistic. And kind of really one of the major, I guess, sources of optimism was that they would have more of a say in what went on under the British kind of umbrella in the British Empire. That because they contributed to these war efforts and this big victory, that maybe they had earned their stripes, and that the British government would take into account some of their thoughts and feelings and what they had to say and what they wanted out of the government. What we're going to see is, that doesn't happen. The British kind of see themselves as superior to the colonists, and really they don't look at the colonists' efforts in the French and Indian War in the same light that the colonists do. They kind of consider a lot of the colonists to be cowards. As they called it, they thought they were lily-livered, meaning cowardly. Like they were scared to fight, they retreated too frequently, they didn't stick their nose in, kind of toe the line and hang tough. So they thought a lot of the colonists were cowards. They didn't really fight bravely. Again, not something that was shared by the colonists. They also thought they had too much of a self-interest. Colonists did very well economically during the French and Indian War. Whether it was merchants that sold a lot of goods and were subsidized by the British government, meaning they were given aid, or farms that sold a ton of product, food to the British government to feed soldiers. Colonists prospered very, very much during the French and Indian War. Oftentimes, as businesses do during a time of war, truth be told. Now, the flip side was the British government thought they were kind of being gouged by a lot of these businesses. They thought the colonists were a little bit too self-interested, that whenever they had like a request like, hey, we need more people, or we need you to give us more supplies, or we need more food, that instead of like chipping into the cause, that colonists were like, all right, this is our opportunity to make some money, or they were slow to say like, hey, we've already given you a lot of troops, we really don't want to give any more, or we don't want to donate money. Like they were slow to kind of come to the cause, is kind of the thought that some British had. So they really didn't think they contributed as much to the war effort as they really did, or at least the colonists thought they did. Now, there's an interesting thought, and again, another kind of maybe a little bit of a cause for divide between the British and between the colonists, is there was some in Great Britain that thought that the colonies might want to look at independence. The fact that the French were no longer there threatening, they thought that, left to their own accords, the colonies might start thinking about independence. Ironically enough, this thought is kicked around in Great Britain way far in advance of when it's kicked around in the colonies. The colonies really aren't thinking this. They're extremely happy under British leadership. They really don't think about independence, but people in Britain are kind of thinking it, for sure. And another gigantic factor in the relationship between the colonists and Britain was this huge war debt after the French and Indian War. Britain more than doubles their debt. So they're thinking of how in the world can we start paying back some of this war debt? This is a little bit problematic. Okay. So the realities of what actually happens in the colonies versus what the colonists think is going to happen are really two different things. Now, kind of piggybacking on that idea of gigantic war debt, there's some thought, there's some things that kind of go on. First and foremost is British soldiers don't leave the colonies. Thousands of British troops stay, and they stay for a couple of reasons. First and foremost is they do have to pay off this war debt. So the thought of the British government is the colonies are really profitable to the British government. So let's go ahead and let's really maximize getting profit out of these colonies. We've kind of ignored them. We've kind of let them kind of run themselves. If we have a presence, we can really kind of centralize control over the colonies and maximize profits. That was a big thought. So British troops are left in the colonies. A couple other things that happened that, for a couple other reasons for a British presence was they did want to restrict settlement. They were afraid, frankly, of conflicts between Native Americans and colonists. So they do want to restrict settlement into some of the new area or some of the new territory that's gained. Like I said, they want to consolidate their empire to maximize that, maximize the profit. They thought they needed to have a presence because there was this concern about independence or independent thought. So leaving troops there, they figured they could consolidate power, they could consolidate people kind of along those towns on the seaboard, and if they spread out all over the frontier, then it would be a lot harder to prevent thoughts of independence, a lot harder to kind of corral. They also want to protect against the French. French have been eradicated basically from North America, but who's to say without any British protection that they don't come back and try to get some of their territory back? That was a legit concern. And the last thing is they really wanted to contain Native Americans. They were afraid of growing, threats by Native Americans and Native Americans without the French there to kind of balance things out, that Native Americans would kind of set their sights on the British. And there is a little bit of truth to that. Like, the Native Americans at the time, after the French and Indian War, are a little concerned about Great Britain being the only presence in North America. They're a little concerned that they were going to push even farther westward and take land. So they do, in this event called Pontiac's Rebellion, they do attack, that is Native Americans. They attack British forts along the outposts of Pittsburgh. And they take a lot of these forts before eventually being put down by the British government. So there's a little bit of concern about the Native Americans, and maybe kind of the relationship between the British government. Now, kind of piggybacking on that idea of huge debt. Now, here's what the British government decides to do about that huge debt. There's a guy by the name of George Grenville that comes into power in England. Like, he is the Secretary of the Treasury, and he comes up with a lot of different laws that are going to greatly affect what goes on in the colonies. One of those was the Proclamation of 1763, which basically says that there's going to be no settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains in the colonies. Excuse me. So again, this optimism that there's going to be all this open space for the colonies to explore and to settle, and maybe if I wasn't one of the wealthy in some of the seaboard cities, I could kind of cast my lot in some other wide open area, and there's lots of land, and I can, build my empire. So this Proclamation of 1763 really kind of cuts into some of that hope. That's not something that they really were fired up about. Some of the others were things like the Sugar Act. The Sugar Act was in response to the low amount of duties that were really collected. When the British government did kind of an audit of the money that was collected in the colonies, they realized that they paid people to collect on duties far more than they actually received in the actual duties themselves. So by a pretty substantial amount, I think it was like 4-1. So they were losing money basically on this collection of duties. And the big reason why is because people in New England were smuggling in things like molasses. So in 1733, the British government passed what's called the Molasses Act, and they had to pay, the colonists had to pay like a tax on molasses. And the British government did this because they wanted the colonists to buy molasses from Great Britain. However, that molasses was far more expensive than it was from purchasing it from France and the Dutch. So now, because it was more expensive, the British government put a really expensive duty on buying molasses from the French and the Dutch, like this 6-pence tax, which made it more affordable to buy from the British. Now, New Englanders needed this molasses because they used it to make rum, which they sold back to some European countries, to West Africa, for some pretty big profits. So instead of buying expensive molasses, they continued to buy it from the French and the Dutch, but they smuggled it in. Hence, they didn't have to pay the big duty, and they also didn't have to pay the high prices from the British molasses. Now, to do this, they had to bribe some of the duty collectors, but it was worth their while with the money they were spending. This idea of the Sugar Act, and the thought was by the British government, is that the New England merchants would act reasonably if they lower the duty, so to about 3 pence instead of paying for the bribe, that it would be closer to even, and then New England merchants would just say, we'll pay a little bit extra to be legit and not have to go through all the trouble of smuggling. They were absolutely wrong on that. Merchants did not love that. Great Britain passes something called the Currency Act, which means no colonial money to pay off any kind of debt that was owed. Now, the currency in the colonies had lost a lot of its value, meaning it wasn't really worth the amount of money that was printed. So if you have like a dollar bill, if your currency drops below that, that dollar bill, even though it says $1, might only be worth like 75 cents. The currency in the colonies that was kind of what was happening. It wasn't worth the amount that was actually printed on it. So the Currency Act said they were not going to take colonial money to pay duties or taxes, that sort of thing. The Quartering Act provided for reasonable accommodations for soldiers. So the soldiers that stayed in the colonies, this Quartering Act said basically that, hey, in the colonies you have to provide somewhere nice for them to stay. And you got to feed them and that sort of thing. So people in the colonies weren't fired up about having to foot the bill for that. The Stamp Act is really one of the things that really united colonists into this idea of potentially rebelling. The Stamp Act was a tax on paper products like college diplomas, playing cards, newspapers, wills, any kind of legal documents. All of those, once you paid the tax, you had like a little stamp that was placed on like your newspaper. That way tax collectors could see that you paid your tax. Now, things like the Sugar Act really affected only people from New England. So even though they're outraged, you didn't see that same outrage in the southern colonies. The Stamp Act, everybody had to pay. So there is this outrage of what's going on here. This kind of prompts and starts this idea of the no taxation without representation. They are really mad that the British are taxing the colonists without any say from the colonists. It isn't so much the taxes, it's the fact that they were levied without any say from those people that actually had to pay. That frustrated them. They were also frustrated that anybody that kind of broke the law, they didn't have a stamp or they didn't pay the sugar tax, was tried in what's called admiralty courts that had no juries. So no people that lived in the area would actually determine their guilt or innocence. What would determine their guilt or innocence was a judge that was appointed by the British. People did not love that. They are not fired up by the fact that they could, this was a obvious idea that the British could raise taxes to raise revenue. And this was very, very frustrating for those people in the colonies. Okay. All right, my time's running short. I'm going to post a little supplemental video to cover that very last question. So I will see you in a few.